Welcome back to Delay the Binge podcast. I'm your host, Pam Dwyer, best-selling author, speaker, and someone who deeply believes that sometimes the most powerful change in our lives begins with something very simple, a pause, a moment where we step out of the patterns that we have been running all of our lives, long enough to see ourselves clearly again. Because when we pause with purpose, something interesting happens. We begin to notice the stories we've been living inside of. And sometimes those stories begin to change. Today's episode is part of a series that is very close to my heart. It's called the Becoming series. Because if you think about it, every sunrise begins in darkness. And somewhere inside every life story, there comes a moment when life quietly begins pointing us toward who we are meant to become. Sometimes that moment comes through a challenge, sometimes through loss, and sometimes through a realization we can no longer ignore. But these moments matter because they mark the place where something shifts, where identity begins to evolve, and where we begin to understand something pretty powerful. We are not starting over. We are picking up the story right where we are, using every experience, every lesson, every trial as fuel for who we are becoming. Today's guest has spent much of her life helping people navigate those exact moments. My guest today is Michelle Cantrell. Michelle is a licensed professional clinical counselor, speaker, and founder of the Center for Growth and Connection in Pasadena, California. For more than a decade, she has helped individuals and couples build healthier, more connected relationships and navigate major life transitions. But her work goes deeper than traditional therapy. Michelle explores the quiet ways many of us organize our lives around rejection, abandonment, or loss, and how those patterns can sometimes keep us living in roles or identities that no longer feel true. Following the end of her own 28-year marriage, Michelle began speaking and writing about the deeper questions that often emerge in midlife. Questions about identity, belonging, vitality, and about what it truly means to begin again. Not by starting over, but by reconnecting with parts of ourselves that may have been waiting to be seen. Michelle, I'm so grateful you're here today. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Pam. I'm really excited to be here. And this topic is so close to my heart, as you just described. So this is really exciting to be able to share with others.
I like when the stars align and you meet someone that thinks like you do and that is passionate about a lot of the same things. So I'm excited too. So before we dive into all the deeper things, I'd love to start with something simple. What has life been like for you lately? What have you been most focused on, either personally or professionally, in this season of life?
Well, I'm going to start with just saying my life is amazing. And I say that, I feel like I do need to say that with a bit of a disclaimer because, the world is not a safe place right now for a lot of people. And there's a lot of scary stuff happening in the world. And so I don't want to disregard that. And while I still take ownership of the incredible things happening in my life. And for me, joy is an act of rebellion. And I have so much joy and wonder and awe and amazement in my life every single day, which I work to cultivate. And so the things I'm most focused on right now, professionally, I'm really wanting to help people take a look at their lives and see if there are places where they are compromising their vitality for security and predictability, which are very important. If we look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, that safety and security is right there at the bottom, right? We need to understand that we are safe in the world. And, there are a lot of people that don't have that. But for those of us who have spent our lives structuring our goals around this idea of who we're supposed to be, we often then get to some place where it feels like we may have crossed the finish line and we still aren't happy, we still aren't satisfied, and we have just shut ourselves down in sort of in search of these things that are never going to be satisfying if we disconnect from ourselves in the process. So my passion, the thing I'm focused on right now, is really helping people look inward and reconnect with themselves and have a healthier relationship with themselves and other people, because I think the former informs the latter.
Mhm.
So, and so I'm working on sharing that message in all kinds of ways professionally. And then in my personal life, I'm just trying to walk the walk and focus on the relationships in my life and orient myself. So I'm actually fairly new to California. I've lived here for 2.5 years, and my marriage fell apart after I moved here.
Oh gosh.
So, I have spent the last 2.5 years really cultivating my community, both personally and professionally. And, for the first time in my life, I'm really working on developing those kinds of relationships. And that has been part of the richness that I experience in my life. And, frankly, Southern California is just a beautiful place to live. So I'm also just focused on enjoying living in such a wonderful place.
Wow. So instilling energy and inspiration not only in yourself, but in others. I think
Yes.
that's pretty powerful.
Well, thank you. I'm on a mission.
Yes, yes. One of the things that really stood out to me when I was learning about your work is how you talk about the relationship we have with ourselves
Mm,
shaping every other relationship in our lives.
yes.
So, can you tell me? I'm curious, what originally drew you into helping people explore their relationships?
Well, I think it comes a lot from the training that I've had as a therapist and really understanding that, I mean, we hear some cliche bumper sticker statements, like you can't really feel loved by somebody else until you love yourself, and or something like that. And, it gets kind of trivialized when we say that, but I think there is an element of truth to it. And what I've come to understand in the work I do with others and in myself is that when we learn in various ways that there are parts of ourselves that are unacceptable to those that we are closest to, we start to exile those parts. We start to hide those parts. And then those parts never get the corrective experience to know that they are indeed lovable, that they are worthy of love. And so if we are showing up in our relationships not as our whole selves, then we're never going to be able to experience the benefit when people do show up and want to love us unconditionally. And so what I've learned is I need to be able to show up for myself first before I can fully show up for other people in relationship. And, in my relationship that I had with my ex, we were together 31 years, we were married for 28 years. And I really oriented my life around meeting his needs in the best ways that I could. I wasn't perfect. But in doing so, it was a constant suppression of my own needs. And that is going to sever my relationship with myself. There was a lot of self-abandonment that happened there. And once I really, was sort of forced into a place where I had to really look at that, the end of my relationship was not my choice. In the end, I feel grateful that we ended up the way we did, and that that choice was made for me. But I now feel I've been set free to reclaim my relationship with myself. And that now informs the relationships that I have with others, because I'm not going to invest in relationships that don't reflect my inherent goodness. And I can't do that if I'm not connected with that.
Wow, I love that.
Mm,
You know, the idea that many of us, mostly women, I'm
mm,
finding from my own research, that we quietly deplete ourselves
mm,
and lose our identities completely. But it's
mhm.
because we are taking care of our jobs, of our
Mm,
families, of our
yes,
spouses, checking all the boxes, doing everything right, looking like we're so successful on the outside, but on the inside, we're quietly depleting our our identities, and
yes,
we forget to focus on that. And a lot of times we reach out to unhealthy behaviors and habits, to temporarily numb that feeling of pain or hurt that we aren't recognizing.
right.
Do you find
Yes.
right, I think many people,
Yeah.
listening might recognize themselves in that without
Yeah.
realizing it.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
can you help us understand how how maybe that pattern would show up in everyday life?
Oh, a million different ways. A million different ways. And, I think I had communicated in some of our exchanges ahead of time that when I first started out in private practice, I was focused on treating eating disorders. And what I quickly realized was every one of my clients were using their eating disorder symptoms to help cope with
Mhm.
relationships that weren't effectively meeting their dependency needs, their very normal, healthy dependency needs. And so I think, we look at rates of depression, we look at rates of anxiety, we look at rates of, suicidality, eating disorders, substance use. In my framework, all of those things are ways of coping with relationships that aren't meeting our needs fully. And so we see it show up in all kinds of different ways. And when I think about some of the communities that I've been a part of in the past where, maybe like even alcohol consumption is really big,
Mhm.
everybody is around alcohol consumption and don't get me wrong, I enjoy a glass of wine or champagne. But when I see people's lives really orienting around that, that's a signal to me that there's something that they're coping with that's really painful. And maybe they're not ready to face it. But I think it shows up in all kinds of different ways.
Right, and that's what we teach on this
Mm,
show is that delay the binge is not all about food, right? It's about just pausing long enough to
mm,
realize the behavior you're doing, whether it's alcohol, food, overworking,
mm,
overpleasing, all the things we
mhm.
tend to do to mask, what's
Yes,
really going on, what the pain really is. I think that
yes,
happens to a lot of us, and we don't realize that the role that we're playing, the role that we're in, it really doesn't fit who we really are.
yeah. Yeah, and, I think you kind of alluded to people pleasing and taking care of people. Those are some other more subtle ways. I mean, we kind of, we know we can recognize that eating disorder behaviors or substance use can be problematic, but I think there are these more subtle ways that are more societally condoned, like people pleasing, especially for women, and, high achievement, right? I
Yeah.
work with a lot of folks who have really successful lives. They have all the things that we're supposed to have. They're supposed to make us happy. They're at the top of their careers. They're financially compensated well. They have the beautiful home and the family and they're traveling all over the world and then they're sitting here coming to me saying, "I should be grateful. Why am I not happy?" And that comes back to that disconnection both from self and other, because we are so afraid to take the risks to hide the parts of ourselves that we often learn are unacceptable. We're too much, we're not enough, we're messy, all of the negative beliefs that most of us hold somewhere.
Yes, yes, and it's just a slow I see it as like a slow
Mm.
death,
Yeah.
when you begin realizing well, first of all, you have all the success surrounding you, right?
Mm.
And you think, I am so blessed. I should be the happiest person in the world."
Yeah.
But in reality, I feel nothing. I'm numb. I don't feel a thing.
Yes.
And how can I fix that? How can I change it?
Yeah.
So it's just that they've piece by piece lost themselves,
Yeah.
over time.
Yeah.
And so it can start affecting your health as well physically. It's not
Mm.
just a mental
For sure.
exhaustion.
Hmm.
The body starts showing signs of exhaustion as well.
Yes.
So,
Yeah.
I mean, do you see that a lot in your practice?
100%. And this is where I like to cite Emily Nagoski's work a lot on burnout. And, she refers, I don't know if she coined the term or if she got it somewhere else, but human giver syndrome and how women just continue to give and give and give. And it
Yeah.
does take a toll on our adrenal glands, our nervous system. And, I think many of us end up operating in what we talk about in the therapy world is functional freeze. It's like we're still moving through life, but to use your word, we might be doing it from a place of numb. And, we're doing the best we can, but that numb it's keeping us from feeling the hard stuff in our
Yeah.
lives, but it also keeps us from feeling the joy, and you
Yeah.
can't have one without the other, and that's
Right.
that's really the hardest part, I think, that gets overlooked when we talk about reconnecting with ourselves. We can paint it in this really lovely way. And, I feel like my job and my mission and for me in my life is to fall in love with myself every single day.
Yes.
But part of that process means confronting things that most of us have spent a lifetime of avoiding. It means, maybe sobbing on your floor for, an hour. It means letting yourself feel the fear of rejection and loss and heartbreak.
Oh, man.
It means, grieving what wasn't in your life in addition to grieving what has been lost. And that is really hard work. That's hard and exhausting work, but let me tell you, the reward on the other side, if you have the ability and means to do it, and I really want to qualify that, not everybody's in a place where they can take those risks.
Mhm.
The reward is incredible. I never imagined I could have the life that I have now, and I'm not talking about, sort of the more situational things. I'm talking about the inner life that I have
Yeah.
now. So yeah,
So you actually love yourself.
I do.
So
Isn't that a stretch?
that fear and that shame that we all carry around, the fear is the biggest one of rejection.
Yeah.
I know you talk a lot about that, and that could stem from, trauma from our childhood or just the way we grew up. Just that fear of failing and of rejection, just and shame, all those
Mhm.
things quietly deplete us and
Yeah.
steal our identity and our power to, grow,
Mhm.
but a lot of times you're right, people don't know or, like you said, don't have the type of life where they can slow down, but I always tell people, it's just a few seconds, people, where you just take a moment
Yeah.
to focus on, "Okay, why am I acting this way? Why
Yeah.
am I lashing out in anger? Why am I about to eat this huge piece of chocolate cake when I know it doesn't serve me? Or why
Yeah.
am I having a sixth glass of wine instead of
Yeah.
just one?"
Right.
And if we don't take time just to
Mm.
process and let the brain understand, because I've been doing a lot of research. The neuroscience of what the brain does
Yes.
is incredible to me. I'm obsessed with it.
Mhm.
The
I feel you. We could nerd out on that. This is a whole different, episode.
Yes. Yeah, there'll have to be a whole new one. Um, I also you shared with me, and I'm not sure if you feel comfortable sharing it or not, a very powerful,
Mm.
personal experience that happened recently on Valentine's Day, I believe.
Yeah, yeah, it was actually the day after Valentine's Day. I'm happy to share it because it was such a powerful moment that I think captures a lot of the message that I'm trying to convey. And, Valentine's weekend, I had planned ahead, and I've never been big on celebrating Valentine's Day. Even when I was married, it was never a thing. When our kids were little, maybe we'd get them a little chocolate, but that was about it.
Yeah.
But I understand there's like this significance to the day, especially when you are not partnered with somebody. So the day before Valentine's Day, I had a Galentine's Day evening with some friends, kind of in similar life stages, and that was wonderful. And then the next evening, I had a Galentine's Day with my kiddos, and that was wonderful. But, at the same time, I was also, as a newly single person, I have a dating life, and I'd been spending time with somebody, and I was struggling that that person we weren't exclusive, and that person, was with somebody else on that day,
Oh,
and it was totally part of our agreement, like, nothing he wasn't doing anything wrong. But, there's that young part of me that wants to feel picked, that young part of me that wants to feel special. And that it didn't matter how many female friends I was surrounding myself with, that part was, feeling a little neglected, feeling a little ignored. And so I was kind of feeling like the weekend was a little bumpy. And the day after Valentine's Day, I was not having a good day. I had all kinds of frustrations happen that day. And I I decided I needed to reconnect with myself, and I have rituals for doing that. And one of them is doing some guided breath work, which is very powerful for me. And so I did a guided breath work meditation, and then I took a long bath. And I have a kind of a soundtrack for myself. And so I put on my playlist, And while I was in the bathtub, surrounded by my candles, dimmed lights, and my eyes closed, listening to this music, one of the pieces that came on, I suddenly started having these almost like dreamlike visions. It wasn't like hallucinations. My eyes were closed. It was just images coming to my mind's eye. And there's this woman in these white robes, very kind of angelic looking, who held a baby in her arms and handed the baby to me. And in this vision, I immediately recognized that this baby was me.
Oh, gosh.
And while I'm in the bathtub, I just start sobbing. And I just in my vision, just held this baby in my arms and said, I'm here now. I love you. You belong to me.
Oh,
And
my
I
gosh.
just said it. And I was doing this. I was, kind of cradling myself in the bathtub. And that, then what surprised me was then another younger version of me showed up. And this one was 10. And 10 years old was when I started getting shamed for my body, from my father, and getting put on diets and being given the message that, how my body appeared was very important. And this young 10-year-old needed to know she's lovable even with her round belly. And so I brought her in and gave her this hug and said the same thing to her. I'm here now. I love you and you belong to me. And then my 14-year-old part came up. And let me tell you, talk about checked out. My 14-year-old part was highly dissociated. She didn't really care whether she lived or died. She put herself in a lot of risky situations, not really worried about the consequences. And I brought her in and I said, I'm here now. I love you and you belong to me. And then kind of fast forwarded, then this 40-year-old version of me showed up. And this one was going through some pretty tough times. And she came to me in this vision after having walked into the woods on a cold fall day and just wishing she could go to sleep and never wake up. And in this vision, I just swooped her into my little circle of parts and said, I'm here now. I love you and you belong to me. And then finally, the 51-year-old version of me, the one whose marriage was falling apart, the one who was lying on the floor of my bedroom in a fetal position, not knowing what was going to happen next. And I said the same things to her. I said, I'm here now. I love you. You belong to me. But I also said, you're going to be okay. You're going to get through this. And it's going to be so amazing on the other side of where you are right now. And it's okay that you are scared. It's okay that you have grief. It's okay that you want to just collapse. But I'm here to tell you the other end of this is amazing. And as I'm having all of this in the bathtub, I'm like sobbing. I'm like,
I'm
you know,
about to sob.
just catching my breath. But it was this incredible moment of reconnection. And I've been doing a lot of that over the last year and a half. That work is not new to me. That didn't just come out of nowhere. That's, because of the structures I put in place around my own healing and recovery and growth. And so, it was sort of a reminder, I've gotten really busy this year. I've had an incredible year. I've had lots of things happening professionally and personally. And so sometimes these parts do get left behind.
Yeah.
And I realized this was a reminder that it needs to be a daily practice to be connecting with these parts in the same way that if we're in relationships with others, we need to have daily practices, saying the I love yous, touching in, even if you're busy. And so that moment like really recentered me and recalibrated me in a way that was really, really powerful and has been I've been trying to kind of ride that since then, even though that was only a month ago.
Oh my gosh. Michelle, first of all, thank you for sharing something so beautiful and raw because
Um,
that's just incredible. So thank you for that. And it also should be, I think, a movie
you
because,
get to
it's the one where you
me.
watch it and you're so just drawn in, it would just be a really like one of those little short films. I
Mm-mm.
think we could do something with that, really.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Yeah. Mm.
when you had that realization, that you could become the one you've been waiting for all this time,
Yeah.
is what shifted for you after that moment? I mean, did it make a huge difference for you from that point on?
It really did because I feel like, just a couple of weeks ago, I came across this Maya Angelou book that was it was an illustrated book, and based on one of her poems said, I think it's the world doesn't frighten me anymore, and or life doesn't frighten me anymore. I wish I could remember the name of it. And I've been quoting her a lot. There's a quote that she has that about belonging that I adore and I repeat to myself often. And it really is about just belonging to yourself. And so I don't want to, and I was like, yeah, I'm not afraid. And then I realized that's actually not true. I mean, most of the time I don't feel a lot of fear at this point in my life. I'm not driven by fear as much. But what I realize is it's not accurate to say I'm not afraid anymore, because that's not a human thing to say. Fear is a very normal human emotion for us to experience. And there are many moments when it's an appropriate response. But what I realized is I'm no longer controlled by my fear. And I'm no longer controlled by my fear because I'm secure in myself. I know that I have everything I need within me to be able to cope with the inevitable heartbreak, disappointment, rejection, failure, loss. All of those things, as long as I'm living and breathing, all of those things will continue to happen in my life unless I structure my life in such a way that I'm never, taking the risks, right? And then that makes us small again. And
Mhm.
the biggest shift for me is just realizing, like, I've been to hell and back internally. And, like, I've done that journey, and
Mhm.
now I know, like, if I can be there for myself, and that doesn't mean I don't ask for help. In fact, it's the opposite. It means that I'm secure enough in myself that when I need help, I can ask for it, and that I live in a tribe of interdependence around the people who are so important to me. So this isn't about being super self-reliant or overly self-reliant. It's about being confident in myself that I have everything I need to succeed in the life that I want, including being able to ask others for help when I need it.
Yeah, and it seems to me like you've learned what I have, which is I used to hate the climb, right? The climb of
Mm.
the mountain to get to the top.
Yeah.
But I've been to many scenarios of being at the top,
Yeah.
and it's very quiet, and it's not what I thought it would be up there. I get like, "This is it?"
Mm,
And what I
mm,
realized is it's the journey where my eyes were
mm,
shut the whole time. Now I open them and I look
mm.
around, and just the journey is what makes us who we are.
Yeah.
And yes, they're full of trials, and they're
Mm,
not all roses and sunshine,
yeah.
but it's part of what is helping us learn and grow and be better all
Yeah.
the time.
Yeah.
And so that's just my form of midlife. You talk a lot about midlife transitions,
Mm, mhm.
and you talk about something I don't know what it is. I was gonna ask you, and maybe our listeners do or they don't, I don't know. But what is gray divorce?
Mm. Yeah, it is a term that's being used a little bit more.
Mhm.
I didn't make it up. There's if you Google it, you will find some. I think a New York Times article not that long ago. And there's probably not a single definition of it, but the way I have come to understand it and the way I relate to it is it's referring not just to divorce or separation after having been partnered um, in midlife, but the phenomenon of going through that after having been partnered, often for decades, because it's not just the divorce, it's not just midlife, it's the monumental identity shift that comes after you have oriented your life around this one model of living, and then that model gets upended overnight often. And so it's really navigating this major life transition after, especially for women. And I know it can be a monumental shift for men too, so I don't want to minimize their experience. But particularly for our generation, where I think we were still really groomed to orient our lives around, especially in heteronormative relationships,
Mhm.
around partners, where the male partner, his job was to go out and, have a career, and the female partner, even if we did have jobs and careers, we were still the ones doing a lot of the domestic labor and the relational labor. And so I know for myself personally, I really did derive first and foremost my identity from my role as a wife. And so when that got taken away from me after having, I mean, I married longer than I wasn't, because we got married very young. And so much of my identity was around taking care of my partner, being the best wife I could be. I took great pride, and sometimes his friends would be like, "Wow, you're so lucky," because I was so chill and easygoing, and like I didn't ask
Mhm.
for I didn't complain. Um, so it's sort of this convergence of the identity piece, the being in midlife, which comes with other transitions, particularly for women around menopause and perimenopause. So our bodies are going through a monumental shift. It might be more challenging to regulate our emotions. We
Mhm.
might be able to focus as much. We experience our bodies differently. A lot of physical changes. Maybe there's weight gain, sexual arousal changes, that sort of thing, that also can be wrapped up in identity. And then you add into that what often happens at that same time is empty nest,
Yeah.
taking care of caregiver, yeah, of parents, aging parents. And so it's like this convergence of so many things. If we think about, what it means to be gray, it's like this
Mhm.
expanded life. So gray divorce often coincides with all of these other major life transitions that just make it, I think, a unique experience, not better or worse around
Right.
the divorce process, but it is a different beast than, somebody who's going through divorce in their 30s and, maybe have been married for 5 years. Totally different beast. Again, it's not that that's a better experience or a worse experience, but I think understanding the impact of all of these forces coming together is really important when we talk about divorce in midlife.
Wow, that's a lot. It's and it sounds to me like maybe a lot of people think midlife and is more of an ending,
Mm,
but
mm,
you're describing them as turning points
yes.
and seasons. It kinda makes me think about my granny, who was the one and only person in my life growing up that was the she still to this day is the wisest woman I ever met. And she used to tell me I used to worry about her because she was alone.
Mm,
And I'd say, "Granny, aren't you lonely? Are you sad that you're by yourself every day?" And she says, "Oh, honey, no." She goes, "I have friends and I can see them when I want. And when I want to be alone, I can be alone." She
mhm,
goes, women are like flowers, Pam." That's what she would tell me. I'm like, "What do you mean?" And she said, "Well, every phase or season in our life, we establish a flower petal. So it could be a trial, something
mm,
horrible, something joyful, but it's a flower petal. And
mm,
slowly over time, as we age, we are becoming this
mm,
gorgeous, full flower
mm,
blooming." And she says, "And that's how I feel at this
mm,
stage in my life. I feel like this beautiful flower."
mm.
And she says, "And then when we go to heaven," she goes, "we're just this gorgeous rose or, a flower." So I love that analogy because I relate to that now more than ever.
Yeah, and I think that's an important message to send, because, the truth is the life as I knew it did end. It was an ending. The future I had in front of me, the future I had anticipated for myself, growing old with a partner, I envisioned us celebrating a golden anniversary one day. We were young enough when we got married that was well within reason to think that was a possibility. And so there was a lot of endings that came along with this change in my life. But you can't have a new beginning without an ending. And what lies ahead of me now with the freedom that I have and the connection with myself that I have and the life that I'm building is so much more than what I ever could have imagined for the life that I thought I had in front of me.
You are a beautiful flower.
Mm. I love this because my grandmother was also into flowers. And so I am very much, this is in honor of my grandmother, my sleeve on my arm, which has lots
Oh,
of flowers. Yeah.
yeah. Grandparents are critical, especially if you're
Mhm.
close with them.
Yeah.
You know, I want to circle back a little bit because on this podcast, we talk a lot about brain patterns
Mhm,
and
mhm.
understanding the frontal cortex versus the
Yeah.
lower brain chatter.
Mhm,
And there's habits and coping strategies that
mhm.
quietly shape your life.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's overworking or people pleasing, like we mentioned before.
Mhm,
And sometimes it's just staying in a situation that
mm.
no longer feels aligned.
Yeah.
So, what are some signs that someone might be living inside a pattern that
Mm.
no longer supports who they are becoming? Because
Yeah.
they're a lot of times people can't see it.
Yeah. Well, I'll lead from my own experience. And I will say this is, a little bit of hindsight is 2020.
Mm.
And, I wanna help people maybe not have to wait to figure things out. But about, 3 or 4 years ago, I decided I needed to go back into therapy. And, as a therapist, I'm always in and out of therapy. I wanna continue my own personal journey and growth. And when I started with my therapist, I told her I can't experience joy. I was who I like to work with, right? I had it all. I had the wonderful life, the wonderful marriage, the kids, the suburban home, the career that was very fulfilling for me, but I couldn't feel joy. And I also, the flip side of that, I couldn't cry. And I often joke, I don't know if you've ever seen the movie The Holiday with Cameron
Yeah.
Diaz and, um, oh, my mind's blanking on her name, Kate Winslet. And, the whole movie, Cameron Diaz's character is trying to cry, and she tells the story about how the day she's never cried again. And I felt like that. Like, I would watch shows and movies, and, every now and then a Hallmark commercial might get under my skin, but I felt like I couldn't have access to that part of me, and I could see that that was correlated. I could see that, like, my inability to feel one was related to my inability to feel the other. And when I went back into therapy, I presumed I was like, I must still, even though I'd done a ton of trauma work for my childhood stuff, I was like, there must be some stone that I haven't turned over yet. Um, Now what I realize is that I couldn't feel joy because there wasn't room in my relationship for it.
Exactly.
And and it wasn't until I got on the other side of that that I could realize that. But I think that's a really important sign that if you're just feeling like you're going through the motions, and there can be all kinds of other reasons for that, but if you are feeling like you're just going through the emotions, if you're telling yourself, I should be grateful and I'm not happy, or I'm, um, you know, feeling numb or disconnected or dissociated, I'd rather just spend my evenings watching YouTube or Netflix and checking out.
Just
These are
checking
really,
out, numbing out.
yeah, these are really important signs. Those may be ways for you to actually avoid looking at what's really happening. And again, I want to be compassionate towards that decision not to. I'm very compassionate towards those younger versions of myself that weren't willing to see what was happening because there was security and predictability in my life, and that was worth a lot for me.
Yeah.
There and my ex-husband and I, we had a good enough relationship in a lot of ways. We weren't a high conflict couple. We got along very well. We did a lot of stuff together. So it was good enough. But what I didn't realize, and this is not through any overt fault of his own, there just wasn't room for me to grow in that relationship. And again, we were very young when we got married. So we did a lot of growing together, but then we reached a point where I don't think either of us could continue growing in the ways that honored our true selves. And I really honor that in him. We had a very amicable separation. And so, I want him to live his best life. And I know he wants me to live my best life. And we realized we couldn't do that together anymore.
Man, that is just that's love right there.
Mm,
Letting go, because
yeah.
we talk a lot about relationships in the way that sometimes you evolve
Yeah.
into a person that, you know, can no longer be with the same
Yeah.
group or the same friends. You especially like I'm a retired youth minister. And so we
Mm,
used to the kids would always talk about the friends I had in middle school, they aren't my friends anymore now in high school. And they would be so upset about it. And we'd tell them, well, it's because you're no longer the person you were in middle school.
mm,
You're
mm.
evolving into the
Yes.
person you're going to be and who you
Yeah.
really are
Mhm.
already. It's just you are discovering that person.
Yeah.
And it was just heavy discussions. But, at all ages, we feel that where we're outgrowing the situation we're in, but
Yeah.
we fear, right, not being in it.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
we talk a lot about the pause,
Yeah.
that moment where you stop reacting automatically, like a robot, and you
Mhm.
begin to choose differently. But the only way that you can do that is if you get curious, right? You get
Yeah.
curious and try to understand, why am I not feeling any joy?
Mhm.
And always seek, you know, therapy as well. I'm a big advocate for that. It saved my
Yeah.
life.
Yeah.
So, and journaling,
Yep.
but
Yep.
just little things that you can do to figure it out, because something's not right.
Yeah.
If you're not feeling joy and you're numb inside, what's
Mhm.
going on? Take a
Yeah.
moment just to
Exactly.
try and figure it out.
Yeah.
Do you see something similar happening in the work? I mean, do you see that a lot in your work with people?
Yeah, yeah, I think it's, sometimes we can't see what's right in front of our face, right? We need to be able to take a step back in order to see what's really happening, and there are all kinds of ways we can do that, whether it's, having a therapist reflect it back to you, or, I do my daily morning pages, so I write every day, but that's a newer practice for me, and I often wonder what I would have discovered if I had been doing this earlier. Because eventually, that blank page, it wants to be filled. And so
Oh, yeah.
eventually the truth starts leaking out, whether or not you want to put it on paper. And so, really finding ways to be able to look at what's happening in your life. It might even be something like yoga or breath work, like these ways to connect with yourself. There's information in our bodies, going back to sort of the neuroscience and the physiology of all this. There's lots of information in our bodies that's there if we want to get curious. And if
Mhm.
I had really tuned into that sooner, I might have discovered things that it took my marriage ending to discover.
Right, and it's just the awareness, right?
Mhm.
Where we become aware of what's really happening, but you
Yeah.
have to stop long enough, pause long enough to say, "Okay, what's happening here?"
Yeah. Yeah.
And so when you've lost parts of yourself along the way, that's the other thing, is that the realization, the awareness is one thing, but then once you're aware, I mean, and to be honest, we all really know what we should be doing, but where does the reconnection begin? Like, what's the first step someone can take to um to begin a relationship with themselves again, to find themselves, to begin that relationship?
Yeah, well, I think the key word that you used before was curiosity. I
Yeah.
think it's just curiosity and really asking yourself in any given moment, which part of me is showing up right now? And what does that part need in this moment? And I very much use parts language in how I conceptualize my own experience of the world and everybody that I interact with. And to me, it just makes sense, right? It explains why we have a part that wants to stop binging, and another part that says this is the only way to deal with my pain, right? If we're kind of using that framework for understanding. And so I think really just learning to ask that question over and over and over again, what part of me is showing up right now, and what is that part trying to tell me? What does that part need right now? What does that part need from me? Does that part need to know I'm here, you belong to me, I love
Mm,
you?
I
does
love
it
that.
need does it need rest? Does it need play? Does it need sensual experiences, which can come in all kinds of forms? Does it need adventure? Right? It's really just coming back to that curiosity and understanding that whatever we're doing makes sense if we understand the context for it. And that context can come in the form of these parts, right? So if, I think about going back to eating disorder behaviors. When I was working with eating disorder clients, almost all of my eating disorder clients had learned to use food really early in their lives because they didn't have access to a lot of other coping strategies, right? And it's a
Mhm.
natural way to self-regulate when you don't have caregivers that can help you co-regulate. And so when we think about a lot of these parts that are engaging in these behaviors, they're often really young parts, and they just need to know they're lovable, they're okay as they are, they're worthy, they're good enough. And so it's just, how do we approach our behaviors and what those behaviors represent for those parts?
I really like how you reference the different stages of who you're right, your person, like the child, the baby, the child,
Mhm.
because you're right, when we're young, that's when those, patterns start happening, and the brain loves patterns, so
Oh,
it's
yeah.
always gonna resort to that
Mhm.
pattern, whether it's good or bad,
Right.
and I find that speaking to the child in the Pan child, so a
Mm.
lot of times, my emotional outlet is food. I
Mhm.
used to weigh 350 pounds,
Mm.
and it took me forever to figure out it wasn't the tool that was gonna fix
Mm.
me.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
it's what I needed to fix here that brought me there in the first place. So
Mhm.
I started this is actually where Delay the Binge came from. I
Mm.
started
Mm.
telling my child, like, if I
Mm.
was gonna eat something that doesn't serve me, I know that it's not gonna do me well, but I'm still gonna eat it anyway. I would say, "Look, little Pam, we
Mm.
can have this, but tomorrow, just
Mhm.
not right now."
Right.
And man, it would work because tomorrow would happen and it was a long enough break where I just didn't want it. I had time to think about why I shouldn't have it.
Yeah.
But
Well, and I think the beauty in that pause too is it's also sending that signal to yourself that whatever you're feeling that you're trying to avoid with the
Mhm.
food is actually okay to feel.
Yeah. Yeah, you're
It's
not broken. I tell people all the time, "You are not broken. This is
yeah,
not about willpower,"
yeah, yeah.
you know? But if there's one message you hope someone listening today carries with them
Mhm.
after this little conversation, and it's too short, but what
Mhm.
would it be?
To fall in love with yourself every day.
Just love that.
Because when you can do that, everything else falls into place. Doesn't mean everything's perfect,
Right?
but it means whatever you face, you can face with strength and courage and the confidence that you can get through anything and really build the life that you want.
Gosh, this has just been so amazing. So this is an episode that people are gonna play over and over again because they wanna hear all the nuggets.
Wow. Well, that's wonderful. I've so enjoyed having this conversation today.
Oh, me too. Thank you so much for sharing the professional insights and that beautiful personal story with us today.
Yeah.
Listeners, if listeners would like to learn more about your work or connect with you, where can they find you?
Oh, yes. So I do have a website for my group practice, which is the Center for Growth and Connection. So the website is centerforgrowthandconnection.com. And I do have various socials, which I think you said might be in the show notes. But
Mhm.
on Instagram, we are Grow and Connect LA, but there's some underscores in there. And I also have an account on TikTok where I share videos and might, try and do little nuggets. So those are usually the best places, and it's always under the Grow and Connect LA kind of label.
Wonderful. And yes, everybody don't panic. We'll have it all in the show notes so that you can find her easily and follow along with her wisdom and her
Mhm.
nuggets.
Yeah.
Um, and for those of you today listening, if something in the conversation resonated with you, it might be because you're standing in one of those becoming moments yourself.
Mhm.
The place where something in your life is shifting, where an old identity no longer fits, where deeper questions begin to surface. And if that's where you are right now, I want you to remember something. You don't have to figure everything out today. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is pause, take one small step forward, and trust that every experience you've lived has been preparing you for who you are becoming. Thanks for being here. And Michelle, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with us today.
Thank you, Pam. This was wonderful. I enjoyed our conversation.
I did too. I'll see you guys next time on Delay the Binge podcast. Talk to y'all next week.
Thank you.